Hi everyone, my name is Hunter and I'll be discussing informed consent regarding an informed consent form I found here where I reside in North Carolina as my example. I'm going to read the recommendations by the ACA Code of Ethics and what they think that should be included in the informed consent and how that corresponded with the one that I found. First, it's recommended that the purpose, goals, limitations, risks, and benefits of service are all specified in the informed consent, which I think my example did a great job of doing. He actually spent a considerable amount of time in the informed consent talking about the purposes of therapy and the risks and benefits, and included the positives that can come of counseling and as well as some of the negatives. And he was very clear in that, which I thought was very good and lined up very well with what was expected. Next, the counselor's qualifications, degrees, licenses, certifications, specializations. This section was kind of interesting. He did speak on the kind of approaches he uses in therapy and how it varies definitely from client to client, which I can appreciate. That it's tailored to each specific person. He says that he uses multiple different approaches during the course of therapy, and I thought that that was very smart of him to list that each client will definitely look different in what he uses as far as approaches. But other than that, what I found really interesting was that so he discussed the approaches he uses, and he discusses his license. Well, he doesn't really even discuss his licensing. He just, you know what he's licensed as by his name. But other than that, he didn't spend any time talking about his qualifications or his experiences, such as where his degrees are from or where he did any of his clinical work, which I found really interesting. I think it makes it more personable when that kind of information is included. You feel like you know a little bit more about the counselor going into therapy. So I found that kind of interesting that he didn't really include any of that information, although I imagine that kind of information can probably be found on the website for his practice, but again, was not mentioned his qualifications really or experiences, just the licenses that he holds. The one hard thing that he did not mention at all in the informed consent was the arrangements. If something happens to him as a counselor, he only discussed what would need to happen if the client had an emergency and who the client should contact, but he never mentioned what should happen if something happens to him as the counselor. Which I found interesting. I feel like that would be pretty important information to know, definitely in informed consent. He did speak of the technology roles, and very briefly, he did mention to proceed with caution. Obviously, anytime you're communicating via email, even though he provided his email, he did kind of warn clients that email is not always as protected information. And so technology roles were very briefly discussed. He did mention, he did not mention tests and reports used for diagnoses. I don't know if that's because he just doesn't use testing in his practice, but he didn't mention any of that. He only mentioned possible implications if you receive diagnoses, which is back from when I was talking about the beginning when he was speaking of the risks and benefits. He made sure to mention that you may have to make tough decisions when in counseling and things that some people may not agree with, and potential problems that could cause. Including implications for diagnoses, but never mentioned the use of tests or reports. He did very clearly speak on his fees and billing info and procedures for non-payment. That was very clear. He did mention very clearly confidentiality and its limitations. He very clearly mentioned the client's rights to their counseling and records, and he did not really mention the client's rights to refuse any services. I think it was more just kind of something that he implied, and something that was kind of meant to be taken into interpretation, just by the way he explained himself throughout. It was very obvious to me that he wants more than anything to have a trusting and open, honest relationship with the client. So it was kind of meant to be inferred from that, I think. So he never specifically said, you as a client have a right to refuse my services, that I found. In regards to my state boards and regulations, if you go onto the North Carolina Board of Licensed Clinical Mental Health Counselors webpage, it didn't provide its own list of recommendations for informed consent. Instead, it just provided a link to the PDF for the ACA Code of Ethics, which I imagine they did just to say North Carolina wants to hold counselors to the same level that the ACA does. Some interesting things that I thought he mentioned in his informed consent were his beginning paragraph. He said, note any questions or concerns you have and we can discuss them before beginning therapy. That he wants to help establish the clarity and understanding and true trust essential to a therapeutic relationship. I thought that that was really nice for him to say, that he shares this to establish those kinds of things. I appreciated that he included a whole paragraph on his choice to use more than one approach in counseling, and where he draws his therapeutic approaches from. And I also think it was important that he mentioned consultation, and he did that really well. I think that was very smart of him. He said that he consults regularly with other professionals regarding his clients, and that these professionals are bound to the same confidentiality measures listed as him. So basically saying, sometimes I go the step beyond and consult with other professionals about what should be done, which I think truly speaks to his level of appreciation for the client and wanting what's best for them, that he would consult with others in best practice, and making sure that the clients knew that those other professionals are held to the exact same standard as far as confidentiality, and that they're not allowed to discuss, obviously, what he speaks about to them. I also thought it was interesting. He wrote a paragraph about that after a reasonable period of time after the initiation of treatment, he would be able to offer initial impressions of what their work would include. I thought that that was really important that he said it that way, and I think it shows that he cares about his client and saying, I want to get to know you a little bit first so that I can provide you a very accurate representation of what our counseling is going to look like, versus trying to give it to the client on the first session when you may not really know very much, not know much about the client themselves. So overall, I think he cares about the clients and honesty in the profession. Again, surprised that there wasn't any mention of his experiences or qualifications. And I also just think it's important to mention that in addition to the written consent, there's some things that should just be discussed verbally so that the client really understands. But yeah, that's what I found regarding my state and the example in my state and what the ACA recommends. Thanks, guys.